Imagine boarding a plane for a routine 6-hour flight. You say goodbye to your family. You take your seat. You buckle your seatbelt. And then, somewhere over the ocean, the plane simply disappears. On March 8, 2014, Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370 took off from Kuala Lumpur, bound for Beijing. There were 239 people on board. But less than an hour after takeoff, something happened that would turn this ordinary flight into one of the greatest mysteries in aviation history. The aircraft disappeared from civilian radar. No distress call, no confirmed crash site, and no explanation for what happened to the people on board. But here's the strangest part. How? MH370 didn't simply vanish. Evidence later showed that the aircraft continued flying for hours after it disappeared from radar. And 12 years later, we still don't know exactly where the plane is. It was shortly after midnight in Malaysia when MH370 took off from Kuala Lumpur International Airport. The Boeing 777 was heading north towards to Beijing. Everything appeared completely normal. The aircraft was carrying 227 passengers and 12 crew members. At around 1:19 in the morning, the crew made what would become the final confirmed radio communication with Malaysian Air Traffic Control. The message was simple. "Good night, Malaysian 370. Those would be the last known words from the cockpit. Just moments later, the aircraft disappeared from civilian radar. At first, controllers thought it might simply be a communication problem. But then, investigators noticed something much more disturbing. The aircraft had changed direction. Instead of continuing toward Beijing, MH370 turned around and crossed back over the Malaysian peninsula. It then flew northwest before eventually heading south. And this was not just a theory based on a mysterious radar signal. Military radar data later showed that the aircraft had continued flying after disappearing from civilian radar. Some of the aircraft's systems had also stopped transmitting normally. The question became terrifyingly simple. Why would a modern Boeing 777 suddenly turn around and continue flying away from its planned destination?
At this point, investigators had a massive problem. They knew where MH370 had been, but they didn't know where it went. There was no traditional emergency beacon leading rescuers to the aircraft. There was no confirmed wreckage, and the Indian Ocean is enormous. But then investigators discovered something that would completely change the search. Even after MH370 stopped communicating normally, its satellite communication system continued interacting with a satellite. These weren't normal messages. They were automated signals exchanged between the aircraft and an Inmarsat satellite. And although these signals didn't contain the plane's GPS coordinates, they contained something incredibly useful: timing information. By analyzing the signals, investigators could estimate the distance between the aircraft and the satellite at different moments. This created enormous arcs across the Indian Ocean. And suddenly, investigators had a general idea of where MH370 could have gone. The evidence pointed toward the southern Indian Ocean, one of the most remote areas on Earth. And according to the analysis, the aircraft may have continued flying for several more hours after it disappeared from radar. Think about that. For hours, a Boeing 777 may have been flying over the ocean, while nobody on the ground knew exactly where it was. Eventually, the satellite data pointed toward a final region known as the Seventh Arc, and that became the focus of one of the largest underwater searches in history. The search for MH370 quickly became enormous. Aircraft searched thousands of square kilometers of ocean. Ships equipped with sonar searched the seabed. Satellites analyzed images. And investigators studied everything they could find about the aircraft's final known movements. But there was one enormous problem. The southern Indian Ocean is vast, remote, and incredibly deep. Finding a Boeing 777 on the ocean floor is like trying to find a needle in a haystack, except the haystack is thousands of meters underwater. Search teams eventually focused on a huge area along the so-called Seventh Arc. More than 120,000 square kilometers of seabed were searched in the main underwater operation. But the aircraft wasn't found. Later, Ocean Infinity conducted another major search, covering more than 112,000 additional square kilometers. Still nothing. No fuselage, no cockpit, no black boxes. Nothing that could definitively explain where the aircraft came to rest. For years, the question remained unanswered. Then, something finally began washing ashore. Beginning in 2015, pieces of aircraft debris began appearing on islands and coastlines across the western Indian Ocean. One of the most important discoveries was made on Reunion Island. A piece of the aircraft's wing, known as a flaperon, was found on the beach. Investigators later confirmed that it came from MH370. Other pieces were discovered in places including Mozambique, Tanzania, Madagascar, Mauritius, and South Africa. Some were confirmed to be from MH370. Others were considered highly likely or almost certain to have come from the aircraft. And this was incredibly important, because the debris confirmed something investigators had already suspected. MH370 had almost certainly ended up somewhere in the Indian Ocean. But the debris created another mystery. If pieces of the aircraft could travel thousands of kilometers across the ocean, where was the main wreckage? Ocean currents can carry debris enormous distances, so investigators used drift modeling to work backward from where the pieces were found. The results helped narrow the possible crash region, but they still couldn't identify the exact location. And without the main wreckage, the biggest questions remained unanswered. So what actually happened to MH370? This is where the story becomes controversial. There are several theories. One possibility is that the aircraft suffered a catastrophic technical or electrical problem. Another possibility is that the aircraft was deliberately diverted. Investigators found evidence suggesting that the aircraft's course changes were not simply random. The official investigation even concluded that the flight path changes were difficult to explain by technical failures alone. But here's the important part. Investigators could not determine who was responsible or exactly why the aircraft was diverted. That distinction matters. There is a popular theory involving the captain, Zahari Ahmad Shah, and his home flight simulator. Some reports have pointed to simulated routes that appeared to resemble parts of the eventual flight path. But investigators did not establish that this proved the captain intentionally caused the disappearance. In fact, the official investigation found no clear evidence of a motive and did not reach a definitive conclusion about who was responsible. There are also theories involving the co-pilot, hijacking, fire, decompression, mechanical failure, and other scenarios. But none of them has been conclusively proven. And that's what makes MH370 so unusual. We have pieces of evidence. We have satellite data. We have radar data. We have debris. We have simulations. But we don't have the one thing that could connect all of those pieces, the aircraft itself. For years, many people believed the search for MH370 was essentially over. But it wasn't. In 2025, Malaysia agreed to allow Ocean Infinity to return to the southern Indian Ocean. The company proposed searching a new area believed to have a high probability of containing the aircraft. The agreement was based on a simple idea: no find, no fee. If the wreckage wasn't found, Ocean Infinity wouldn't receive the agreed success payment. The search resumed at the end of 2025 and continued into 2026. But the first phases didn't locate the aircraft. According to Malaysia's Transport Ministry, the latest search phases covered thousands of square kilometers of seabed without finding the wreckage. And yet, the story didn't end there. In June 2026, Malaysia extended its agreement with Ocean Infinity for another year. So even 12 years after MH370 disappeared, ships are still searching the ocean floor. The aircraft could still be down there, somewhere in one of the most enormous and difficult environments on Earth to search. 12 years have passed since MH370 disappeared, and somehow, this case still doesn't have an ending. We know the plane left Kuala Lumpur. We know it stopped communicating normally. We know it changed direction. We know satellite data indicates that it continued flying south. We know debris linked to the aircraft eventually washed up across the Indian Ocean. And we know enormous areas of seabed have already been searched. But we still don't know exactly where MH370 is. We don't know exactly what happened inside the cockpit. And most importantly, we don't know why. Somewhere beneath the Indian Ocean, the answers may still exist. The flight recorders may still be there. The aircraft's remains may still be there. And if the wreckage is ever found, it could finally answer one of aviation's greatest unanswered questions. Until then, MH370 remains the plane that disappeared, not without leaving clues, but without leaving enough answers. And perhaps the most disturbing question isn't whether we'll ever find MH370, it's this: what will we discover when we finally do?